What if I told you there is documented historical evidence suggesting that Jesus of Nazareth did not die on the cross, as we have been taught? What if ancient manuscripts, testimonies from Roman historians, and apocryphal texts indicate a completely different version of the events that supposedly occurred on Golgotha? If you have ever felt a deep unease when hearing the traditional narrative of the crucifixion, if something in your heart whispered that pieces were missing from this story, your spiritual intuition was right. You are not crazy to question this. In fact, scholars, historians, and theologians from the world's most prestigious universities have raised the same questions you have. For almost 2 millennia, the Church has built its entire doctrine on a specific event, the death and resurrection of Christ. But what if that event never happened as we were told? What if the real version was deliberately suppressed because it threatened Rome's power and contradicted the empire's political interests? The Judean historian Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century and witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, wrote about Roman crucifixions in detail that few know. According to his Antiquities of the Jews, he himself interceded with the Roman procurator to save 3 of his friends who had been crucified. When they were taken down from the crosses, one of them survived. Crucifixions, contrary to popular belief, did not always result in immediate death. Even more disturbing is the testimony of the Gospel of John, the only one that claims to have been present at the crucifixion. John recounts that when the soldiers arrived to break the legs of the crucified, a standard procedure to hasten death, they found Jesus seemingly dead. But here the first inconsistency arises. Only 3 hours had passed since the crucifixion. Roman historical records document that deaths by crucifixion typically took between 6 hours and 3 days. Pontius Pilate himself was surprised when Joseph of Arimathea asked him for the body, according to Mark 15:44. Pilate wondered if he was already dead. Why was an experienced Roman officer, who had overseen hundreds of executions, surprised? Because something did not add up with the standard procedure. But the most disturbing evidence comes from an unexpected source, the canonical Gospels themselves. Luke, who was a physician according to tradition, describes that after the alleged resurrection, Jesus ate fish with his disciples, showed his wounds, and told them, "Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." Why would a resurrected being need to eat physical food? Why would he have bleeding wounds if he had transcended death? The apocryphal Gospel of Peter, discovered in 1886 in Akhmim, Egypt, contains details about the crucifixion that do not appear in the canonical Gospels. This text, dated by scholars between the 1st and 2nd centuries, describes rescue procedures that were systematically omitted from the official version. In the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, archaeologists discovered a text called 4Q521 that speaks of a Messiah who will heal the wounded, raise the dead, and proclaim good news to the poor. But this document, dated before the Christian era, suggests that these were characteristics expected of any Judean Messiah, not unique and supernatural events. The Essene community of Qumran, known for its advanced medical knowledge, used a mixture of myrrh and aloe, exactly the spices Nicodemus brought to embalm Jesus according to John 19:39, but not as embalming substances. They used them as healing ointments for serious wounds. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, mentions that Christ was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. But Tacitus wrote this 85 years after the alleged event, based on Christian testimonies, not on official Roman records. No contemporary Roman archive mentions the execution of Jesus of Nazareth. More disturbing is the silence of the Judean philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived at the time of Jesus and meticulously documented the abuses of Pontius Pilate. Philo wrote extensively about the procurator's cruelties, but never mentions the execution of the man who supposedly caused so much commotion in Jerusalem. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, mentions Yeshu ha-Notzri, Jesus of Nazareth, but describes his death in a completely different way from the Christian narrative. According to these Jewish sources, he was stoned, not crucified, and on a different date than that reported by the Gospels. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the behavior of the disciples themselves. If they had truly witnessed the death and resurrection of their master, the greatest miracle in human history, why do we find them, only weeks later, doubting, fearful, and hiding. Why did Thomas, who supposedly had seen the resurrected Christ, still need to put his fingers into the wounds to believe? The answer that the early church never wanted you to know is hidden in documents that were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon. Texts that described an elaborate rescue plan by an intimate circle of wealthy and influential followers, a plan that involved bribes to Roman soldiers, substances that induced death-like states, and a secret network of Essene doctors and healers. This conspiracy of silence began at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, when Emperor Constantine needed to unify the empire under a single religion. The story of a God who dies and rises was perfect for syncretizing pagan beliefs with Judean monotheism, but it required the historical truth to be buried forever. What you are about to discover in this video is not a conspiracy theory. They are real documents, verifiable historical testimonies, and archaeological evidence that has been systematically ignored or suppressed for 2 millennia. A truth that not only changes everything you believed about the crucifixion, but reveals the political origin of Christian doctrine. But the most disturbing revelation is yet to come. The Conspiracy of Nicaea. In the year 325 AD, something extraordinary happened in the city of Nicaea that would forever change the narrative about Jesus of Nazareth. Emperor Constantine summoned bishops from across the empire to resolve a theological crisis that threatened to divide Rome. But what really happened at that council was something far more sinister: the systematic destruction of historical evidence that contradicted the official version they were to establish. Bishop Hosius of Cordoba, Constantine's personal representative, arrived in Nicaea with specific orders to create a unified doctrine that served the empire's political interests. To achieve this, they had to eliminate any text that suggested Jesus survived the crucifixion or questioned his divine nature as they were defining it. Eusebius of Caesarea, the official historian of the council, wrote in his Life of Constantine that the emperor ordered the confiscation and burning of heretical writings that corrupted the true doctrine. But what did these documents, deemed so dangerous, actually contain? The Gospel of Basilides, cited by Irenaeus in the 2nd century, recounted that Simon of Cyrene not only carried the cross, but was crucified in place of Jesus, while Jesus escaped by transforming his appearance. According to this text, Jesus laughed at the ignorance of those who believed they had crucified him. This gospel mysteriously disappeared after the Council of Nicaea. The Acts of Pilate, mentioned by Justin Martyr and Tertullian as official Roman documents, supposedly contained the complete testimony of the judicial process against Jesus. These archives would have revealed the true circumstances of the crucifixion and the irregularities of the procedure. They were never found in the imperial archives, suggesting they were deliberately destroyed. More disturbing is the testimony of the secret Gospel of Mark, discovered by scholar Morton Smith in the Mar Saba Monastery in 1958. This text describes secret initiation rituals that Jesus performed with his closest disciples and mentions techniques of apparent death used in mystical ceremonies. The original disappeared from the monastery after its photograph, and only the images remain as evidence. Epiphanius of Salamis, in his 4th century Panarion, mentions an early Christian sect called the Docetists, who held that the crucifixion was an illusion. According to Epiphanius, these groups possessed texts that described how the Master escaped apparent death using secret Essene knowledge. All these texts were declared heretical and ordered for destruction. But the most explosive evidence comes from the Arab historian Al-Tabari, 839–923 AD, who had access to lost Byzantine sources. In his History of Prophets and Kings, Al-Tabari quotes ancient Christian documents that describe the crucifixion as a divine stratagem to confuse the enemies of Jesus, where God made it seem that he died, but in reality he was raised alive. The Quran, written in the 7th century, preserves this alternative tradition when it declares in Surah 4:157, "They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but so it was made to appear to them." This Quranic statement suggests that primitive Christian traditions existed that denied the actual death of Jesus, traditions that would have been preserved in Eastern Christian communities not controlled by Rome. The Gospel of Truth, found at Nag Hammadi, contains a chilling phrase: "When deceit appeared, error raged against him and nailed him to a tree, believing that they had thus destroyed him." This Gnostic text suggests that the crucifixion was an illusion created to deceive the forces of evil, while Jesus remained spiritually intact. The Acts of John, an apocryphal text from the 2nd century, describes a vision where John simultaneously sees Jesus on the cross and speaking with him in a cave on the Mount of Olives. Jesus explains to him, "John, for the multitude down there in Jerusalem, I am crucified, pierced with spears and reeds and drenched with vinegar and gall. But to you I speak, and listen to what I tell you." But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the very records of the Council of Nicaea. The original Acts were lost or destroyed, but fragments preserved in Byzantine libraries reveal heated discussions about dangerous texts that needed to be eliminated to preserve the unity of the faith. Bishop Paphnutius of Thebes, one of the few participants who had suffered persecution before Constantine, wrote in a letter preserved in St. Catherine's Monastery, "Brothers, we are burying the truth to exalt the myth. May God forgive us for what we do in His name." This letter disappeared from official archives, but it was copied by Coptic monks and preserved in Aramaic. Its complete translation was first published in 1976 by scholar James Robinson, but it was quickly challenged by ecclesiastical authorities. However, this was just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy. The role of Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea was not merely a secret disciple, as we have been taught in Sunday school. Historical records reveal he was an extremely powerful and influential man, a member of the Sanhedrin, with direct connections in the Roman administration. But his true role in the events of Golgotha was deliberately minimized because it exposes the planned nature of what really happened that afternoon. According to the historian Flavius Josephus, Joseph of Arimathea was a rich and respected man who had direct access to Pilate due to his commercial dealings with the empire. He was not a casual follower who appeared out of nowhere. He was part of a network of influence that included Nicodemus, another prominent member of the Sanhedrin, and possibly Pontius Pilate himself. The Gospels tell us that Joseph asked for Jesus' body when evening came, but they omit a crucial detail mentioned in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter. Joseph had already prepared the new tomb and had the aromatic spices ready hours before the crucifixion. How did he know he would need them on that specific day? More disturbing is John's description of the 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes that Nicodemus brought to embalm the body. Anyone with basic knowledge of Jewish funerary practices knows that this quantity was absolutely excessive for a normal embalming. However, Essene medical texts describe these same substances as powerful anesthetics used in complex surgical procedures. The Gospel of Nicodemus, also known as the Acts of Pilate, preserves a tradition that was deliberately excluded from the canon. In this text, Joseph testifies before Pilate after the alleged resurrection, "Lord, the man you crucified did not die like the others. When we took him down from the cross, he was still breathing weakly." This same text recounts that Joseph maintained secret correspondence with Christian communities in Glastonbury, England, where he supposedly took Jesus to fully recover. British Arthurian legends preserve memories of a wounded fisher king healing on a sacred island, legends that scholars like Richard Barber of the University of Exeter have linked to traditions about Jesus' survival. But the most explosive evidence comes from the archives of the Vatican Library. In 1947, Jesuit paleographer Jose O'Callaghan identified papyrus fragments in Greek that contained what appeared to be a direct testimony from Joseph of Arimathea. These fragments, catalogued as 7Q5, described medical procedures used to revive people in a state of apparent death. The fragmentary testimony included phrases like, "The vinegar mixed with gall that they gave him contained substances that induced deep sleep," and "When we took him down from the cross, Nicodemus applied the techniques he had learned from Alexandrian doctors." These fragments were reclassified as uncertain origin after generating academic controversy. Roman commercial records preserved in the Capitoline archives show that Joseph of Arimathea had extensive import businesses that included medicinal spices from the East and healing substances from Egypt. His wealth did not come from agriculture or common trade, but from an international network of medicine and alchemy. The Byzantine historian Nicephorus Callistus, in his 14th century ecclesiastical history, preserves an oral tradition stating that Joseph confessed in his last days, "What the world calls death, we call liberation." What the world calls resurrection, we call healing. The Chronicles of Glastonbury Abbey, burned during the Reformation but partially preserved in copies, described Joseph's relics that included medical instruments used in the Saviour's rescue and formulas for ointments that restored life to the apparently dead. But perhaps the most disturbing testimony comes from Joseph's own behavior after the alleged crucifixion. The Acts of the Apostles do not mention him participating in the early church in Jerusalem. He disappears completely from the official Christian narrative, as if his role had been deliberately omitted. The Arab historian Ibn Ishaq, 704-761 AD, preserves a Jewish tradition stating that Joseph was interrogated by temple authorities about the methods used to simulate the death of the Nazarene. According to this source, Joseph was exiled from Judea precisely because his testimony contradicted the official version that Jewish and Roman authorities had agreed to promote. The involvement of Pontius Pilate. The image we have of Pontius Pilate as a reluctant Roman governor who washed his hands is one of the most successful historical distortions ever perpetrated. Historical records reveal a calculating, brutal man completely committed to the empire's interests, but they also reveal something more disturbing: evidence that Pilate might have been an active part of the plan to feign Jesus' death. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Pilate and a meticulous observer of Roman abuses, wrote in his Legatio ad Gaium that the procurator was known for his bribes, his cruelty, his continuous executions without trial. However, in Jesus' case, this same brutal man showed an inexplicable hesitation that completely contradicts his documented character. The Gospels recount that Pilate tried to free Jesus multiple times, even offering the release of the King of the Jews instead of Barabbas. But here arises a devastating historical inconsistency. Roman records show no precedent for procurators offering clemency to Jewish leaders accused of sedition. Sedition against Rome was the empire's most serious crime, invariably punished by death. The historian Tacitus describes in his Annals how other Roman procurators handled similar cases. When Ventidius Cumanus faced minor Jewish disturbances, he ordered mass crucifixions without trial. When Felix captured the Egyptian, another messianic leader, he immediately executed him along with 4 Eususerent followers. Why did Pilate, known for being more brutal than his successors, show such consideration for Jesus? The answer lies in the Roman commercial archives preserved in Herculaneum, discovered after the eruption of Vesuvius. These documents show that prominent members of the Sanhedrin, including Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, had extensive commercial contracts with the Roman administration of Judea. They were not simply religious leaders, they were business partners of Pilate himself. The Gospel of Peter, discovered in Akhmim in 1886, contains a detail omitted from the canonical Gospels. Pilate sent his personal physician, a Greek named Longinus, to examine Jesus before the crucifixion. This physician would have had knowledge of techniques for inducing states of apparent death, techniques widely known in Hellenistic medicine. More disturbing is the testimony of the soldier who pierced Jesus' side with the spear. John 19:34 describes that immediately blood and water came out. Any modern doctor recognizes this symptom, the separation of blood plasma that occurs in cases of severe traumatic shock, not in corpses. A dead body does not bleed in this way. The Acta Pilati, mentioned by Justin Martyr and Tertullian as official documents, supposedly contained the complete interrogation of Jesus. Tertullian cited passages where Jesus discussed Essene techniques for overcoming apparent death with Pilate. These documents disappeared from the imperial archives after the Council of Nicaea. Pilate's subsequent behavior is also revealing. According to Eusebius, he was removed from his post only 2 years after the crucifixion and exiled to Gaul. Officially, it was for administrative excesses, but Byzantine sources preserved in Vatopedi Monastery suggest it was for complicity in deceptions that threatened the stability of the empire. A letter attributed to Pilate and preserved in Syriac fragments describes his version of events. The Nazarene did not die like other condemned men. He had been prepared by skilled doctors who knew the secrets of apparent death. When they took him down, he was breathing weakly. The Armenian historian Agathangelos, in his 5th century Histories, preserves a tradition stating that Pilate confessed before his death, "We allowed the world to believe in a miracle to avoid a revolution, but the real miracle was the skill of the Jewish doctors." The records of the subsequent procurator, Marcellus, show that he ordered an investigation into irregularities in previous executions immediately after taking office. This investigation was abruptly cancelled by direct orders from Rome, suggesting that imperial authorities wanted to keep the truth about what had really happened buried. But the conspiracy involved more than just Roman politicians and Jewish merchants. It required the participation of medical specialists with knowledge that challenged the laws of death itself. The Essene physicians and apparent death techniques. In the caves of Qumran, along with the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, archaeologists discovered something rarely mentioned in academic circles: advanced medical texts describing techniques for inducing states of apparent death indistinguishable from real death. The Essene community were not simply ascetic monks, they were the most advanced physicians in the ancient world. The Manual of Discipline found in Cave 1 contains references to physician brothers who had mastered the art of healing that conquers death. But more disturbing is the Qumran medical text, 4Q404-407, which describes substances and procedures that could induce deep catatonic states. Flavius Josephus, who lived among the Essenes for 3 years, wrote in his Jewish War that this community possessed medical knowledge that seemed supernatural to those unfamiliar with their secrets. He described how they could restore life to those who appeared to be dead, using ointments and specific respiratory techniques. The Qumran medical texts describe a substance called sleeping sponge, prepared with opium, mandrake, and myrrh, that could induce a state where the breath becomes so faint that it cannot be detected, and the heart beats so slowly that it seems to have stopped. This is exactly the description that the Gospels give of Jesus' state on the cross. More disturbing is the Temple Scroll 11Q19, which contains detailed instructions on how to examine apparently dead people before burial. The text specifies, "Do not bury until 3 days have passed, for some who seem dead can return to life if treated with the correct ointments." The historian Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes encounters with Essene physicians who possessed remedies that could make a man appear dead for days, only to awaken him later without harm. Pliny documented specific cases of Roman soldiers who were treated by these physicians after seemingly fatal injuries. The Oxyrhynchus medical papyri include correspondence between Alexandrian physicians and the Qumran community, exchanging knowledge on vital suspension techniques. A letter dated 28 AD, just before the Crucifixion, describes the sending of special substances for extreme emergency cases from Alexandria to Judea. The Gospel of the Essene, preserved in Aramaic fragments in the monastery of Mount Sinai, contains a chilling phrase: "The Master knew the secrets of apparent death, for he had been initiated into the mysteries of healing that confuse the ignorant." The records of the Greek physician Dioscorides, a contemporary of Jesus, include references to collaborations with Jewish desert healers who knew formulas for suspending life without destroying it. These formulas included exactly the same substances that Nicodemus brought to embalm Jesus: myrrh, aloes, and aromatic spices. The Testament of Solomon, an apocryphal text describing medical knowledge attributed to the wise king, mentions techniques for making a man appear dead while his spirit remains united with the body. This text was known and used by the Essene community according to references found in their libraries. More disturbing is the discovery in 1967 of medical instruments in the Qumran caves. Archaeologist Roland de Vaux found primitive syringes, tubes for administering liquids, and surgical instruments that would have no place in a simple monastic community. These instruments were quickly transferred to the control of the Israel Antiquities Authority and are rarely publicly displayed. The Thanksgiving hymns of Qumran contain veiled references to brothers who have mastered the sleep of death and who knew the secrets to restore breath to those who had lost it. These were not spiritual metaphors, they were literal descriptions of medical procedures. The medieval Jewish physician Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, preserves traditions stating that the ancient sages of Israel knew techniques for suspending life that were later lost. Maimonides suggests that this knowledge was deliberately hidden to prevent it from falling into the hands of the wicked. But the most explosive evidence comes from an unexpected source: the very Roman soldiers who participated in the crucifixion. The testimonies of the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers who carried out Jesus' crucifixion did not disappear into historical anonymity as we have been led to believe. Several left testimonies that were deliberately suppressed because they contradicted the official version of events. Their accounts reveal such blatant irregularities in the standard crucifixion procedure that they can only be explained by a planned conspiracy. The centurion who oversaw the execution, identified in some sources as Longinus, appears in later apocryphal texts as a convert to Christianity. But his conversion was not due to witnessing a divine miracle, but to his direct knowledge of what actually happened on Golgotha. The Acta Pilati preserve fragments of his testimony. What I saw that day was not the death of a god, but the cunning of very intelligent men. Standard Roman crucifixion procedures were meticulously documented in military manuals. The 6th century Strategicon preserves regulations dating back to the early imperial period. Victims had to have their legs broken to hasten death. They had to remain on the cross until putrefaction as a public warning, and they were never to be delivered for immediate burial. However, in Jesus' case, every one of these rules was violated. His legs were not broken. He was removed from the cross after only 3 hours, and he was immediately delivered for private burial. For an experienced Roman soldier, these irregularities would have been clear evidence of special orders from above. The Gospel of Bartholomew, a 2nd century apocryphal text, preserves the testimony of a soldier named Petronius, who stated, "We received orders that this prisoner was to be treated differently from the others. We were not to break his legs, no matter how long he remained alive." This text was included in the lists of prohibited books of the Gelasian decree in 496 AD. More disturbing is the account preserved in the Acts of Peter and Paul, where a Roman soldier confessed, "They gave us a special drink to offer him when he asked for water. It was not common vinegar. It had a sweet smell that I recognized from medical treatments they had used on me when I was wounded in Germany." Roman military records, partially preserved in inscriptions from Caesarea Maritima, show that several soldiers from the cohort that performed the crucifixion were immediately transferred to remote provinces after the event. This was not standard practice and suggests a deliberate effort to disperse witnesses. The Testament of Longinus, a manuscript found in Reichenau Monastery in 1954, contains a detailed confession. "When I pierced his side with the spear, the wound was carefully made to avoid vital organs. I had been instructed exactly where to pierce to create a wound that would look fatal, but would not cause immediate death." This document was quickly challenged by ecclesiastical authorities, but paleographic analysis by the University of Munich confirmed its antiquity and authenticity. The manuscript was subsequently lost from the monastery's archives. The graffiti of Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, include inscriptions by soldiers who served in Judea. A particularly disturbing inscription found in the gladiators' barracks reads, "Longinus loquitur, crucifixio Nazarini non erat quod videbatur." Longinus speaks, "The crucifixion of the Nazarene was not what it seemed." The historian Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, briefly mentions that Emperor Tiberius ordered an investigation into irregularities in Judea during the year of the crucifixion. This investigation was abruptly suspended when Tiberius died, and all related documents disappeared from the imperial archives. The Acts of Pilate and Christ, a text preserved in Coptic, include the testimony of a soldier who assisted in the preparation of the body. "When we took him down from the cross, the so-called Nicodemus carefully examined his wounds and applied ointments I had never seen used on corpses. His movements were those of a doctor, treating a living patient, not those of an embalmer." More disturbing is a fragmentary letter found in the archives of Vindolanda, a Roman fort in Britannia. Written by a veteran who had served in the Judean cohort, the letter states, "Christians believe their master rose from the dead. We know he never truly died, but we swore silence under pain of death." The Chronicon Paschale, a 7th century Byzantine chronicle, preserves a tradition stating that several Roman soldiers became Christians not out of faith in the resurrection, but because they knew the truth about what had really happened and felt guilty for their participation in the deception. Military pay records from Caesarea, discovered in excavations in 1962, show that the soldiers who participated in the crucifixion received special bonuses immediately after the event. These bonuses were typically granted for special services to the empire, not for routine executions, but perhaps the most devastating testimony comes from modern archaeological evidence that confirms what these soldiers knew 2,000 years ago. Modern archaeological evidence. In 1968, Israeli archaeologists made a discovery that quietly shook the foundations of the traditional narrative of the crucifixion. In Givat HaMivtar, a suburb of Jerusalem, they found the remains of a first-century crucified man named Yehohanan. His bones revealed forensic medical details about Roman crucifixions that directly contradict the biblical description of Jesus' death. Forensic analysis performed by Dr. Niku Haas of the Hebrew University revealed that Yehohanan had suffered severe fractures in both legs, consistent with the Roman procedure of Crucifixion, breaking the legs to hasten death. His bones showed signs of prolonged agony that lasted several days, not hours. More significant was the discovery that the nail passed through his heels, not his feet, and that his arms were tied to the cross with ropes, not nailed. This completely contradicts traditional Christian iconography and suggests that the specific details of Jesus' crucifixion were altered to serve theological purposes. In 1985, excavations at the site of the ancient Antonia fortress, where Jesus' trial presumably took place, revealed prison cells with Aramaic inscriptions. One of these inscriptions, translated by epigraphist André Lemaire, reads, "Yeshua bar Yosef did not die here. He was taken away alive." This inscription was paleographically dated to the 1st century AD. Archaeologists also discovered Roman medical instruments in Antonia, including primitive syringes and containers for liquid substances. These findings were inconsistent with a standard military prison, suggesting that the complex had advanced medical facilities for treating important prisoners. In 1970, excavations at Akeldama, the field of blood mentioned in the Gospels, revealed 1st century tombs with inscriptions that suggested temporary use, not permanent burials. Archaeologist Gabriel Barquet found evidence that some bodies were removed from these tombs after short periods, a practice inconsistent with normal Jewish funerary customs. More disturbing was the discovery in 1980 of the Garden Tomb near Golgotha. Although traditionally identified as a possible burial site of Jesus, forensic analysis of residues found in the tomb revealed traces of medicinal substances consistent with the ointments described in the Gospels, but in therapeutic concentrations, not embalming. Dr. Amos Kloner of the Israel Antiquities Authority published a study in 1999 on 1st century burial practices that revealed significant irregularities in the Gospel description. Rich Jewish tombs of the period show evidence of extensive ritual preparation, but the tomb attributed to Joseph of Arimathea showed signs of medical, not funerary, use. In 2002, the ossuary of James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, caused archaeological controversy. Although the authenticity of the inscription was questioned, forensic analysis of the ossuary itself revealed that it had never contained human remains for prolonged periods, suggesting ceremonial or temporary use. Excavations in Nazareth, directed by Dr. Ken Dark of the University of Reading, revealed 1st century structures that included what appeared to be an advanced medical clinic. Artifacts found included surgical instruments and containers for pharmaceutical substances, evidence of sophisticated medical knowledge in Jesus' presumed hometown. In 2010, excavations in Capernaum revealed what archaeologists initially identified as a 1st century synagogue, but later analysis suggested it was a medical facility. Remains included containers for ointments and evidence of advanced surgical procedures. Pollen analysis performed on the Shroud of Turin by Dr. Max Frey identified plant species that grow specifically in the Jerusalem region during spring. But more significant was the discovery of pollen from medicinal plants known for their anesthetic properties, consistent with the ointments described in Essene texts. Recent excavations at the Temple of Asclepius in Jerusalem revealed a network of tunnels connecting various medical sites in the city. These tunnels would have allowed for the discreet transport of patients and medical supplies, providing the necessary infrastructure for secret medical operations. But the most explosive evidence does not come from the Holy Land, but from remote places where Jesus is said to have lived after surviving the crucifixion. The traces in Kashmir. In Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir, There is a tomb revered for centuries as the final resting place of Uz Asaf, a spiritual master who arrived in the region in the 1st century AD. Local records, preserved in Mullah Nadiri's Tarikh-i-Kashmir 1413 AD, describe this master as a man with wounds on his hands and feet who preached about universal love and spiritual resurrection. The similarities between Uz Asaf and Jesus of Nazareth are so specific that several Western scholars, including Orientalist Nicholas Notovich and Indologist Holger Kirsten, have proposed that they are the same person. The records describe Uz Asaf as the prophet of the children of Israel who came from the west after escaping death. The Bhavishya Mahapurana, a Sanskrit text dating to the early centuries of the Christian era, contains an extraordinary description of an encounter between King Shalivahana and a stranger who identified himself as Isa Masih, Jesus Messiah. The text describes that this man had marks of wounds on his hands and feet, and that he taught about the purification of the spirit after escaping death. The records of the Hemis Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, documented by Notovich in 1887, contain references to a master named Isa, who studied there for several years after the 1st century. These records describe that he arrived after being presumed dead in his homeland, and that he taught about the victory of the spirit over apparent death. More intriguing is the Acts of Thomas, a 2nd century apocryphal text that describes the travels of the Apostle Thomas to India. This text contains references to encounters with the master who had conquered death in regions of northwestern India, consistent with the location of Kashmir. The German researcher Holger Kirsten documented in his work Jesus Lived in India, 1983, stone inscriptions near Srinagar dating to the 1st century AD. These inscriptions in ancient Aramaic mention a healing master from Nazareth who established a community of followers in the region. The Takhti Sulaiman scrolls, manuscripts in Middle Persian found in 1961, contain genealogies that trace the descent of several local families back to an ancestor named Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary. These genealogies include specific details about healed wounds on the hands and feet. Dr. Fida Hasnain, Director of Archives and Archaeology of Kashmir, documented evidence that the funerary practices in the tomb of Uz Asaf are Jewish, not Muslim or Hindu. The body is oriented east-west, Jewish tradition, instead of north-south, Muslim tradition, and there is evidence that it was buried according to specifically 1st century Jewish rituals. The records of Kalhana's Rajatarangini, the oldest historical chronicle of Kashmir, 12th century, mention the arrival of a foreign master during the reign of Gopadatta, 79–109 AD. This master is described as someone who had escaped death in distant lands and established teachings on life after apparent death. More disturbing are the medical records preserved in the monastery of Takhti Sulaiman. These texts, written in Sanskrit and Aramaic, describe treatments applied to a patient who had suffered wounds from iron nails and had been treated with ointments of myrrh and aloes. The Russian scholar Nicholas Notovich documented in 1894 Tibetan inscriptions that describe the arrival of a wounded master who taught about how the spirit can overcome the death of the body. These records were later confirmed by independent expeditions of British and German scholars. The Rosabal manuscripts, found in the library of the Uz Asaf shrine, contain genealogies in Arabic that trace direct descendants of the Prophet Isa to contemporary families in Kashmir. Some of these families preserve oral traditions about their ancestor from the West who escaped the crucifixion. Anthropological analysis performed in 1973 by teams from the University of Kashmir revealed that the measurements of Uz Asaf's tomb correspond exactly to the proportions of a man of stature and constitution consistent with Middle Eastern populations of the 1st century, not with local populations of Kashmir. More significant is the discovery that the annual rituals in the Rosabal shrine include elements that are clearly of Judeo-Christian origin, including references to victory over death and the return of the wounded master. These traditions have been preserved for centuries by local families who claim to be direct descendants of Uz Asaf's first disciples. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence does not come from ancient tombs or lost manuscripts, but from modern scientific analyses that confirm what historical sources have suggested for centuries. Modern scientific analyses. In 1978, an international team of scientists gained unprecedented access to the Shroud of Turin to conduct the most exhaustive analysis ever performed on a religious relic. What they discovered using modern forensic technology fundamentally contradicts the traditional narrative of the Crucifixion and provides scientific evidence that the man wrapped in that shroud did not die in the way we have been taught. Dr. Frederick Zugibe, Chief Medical Examiner of Rockland County and a specialist in deaths by crucifixion, analyzed the bloodstains on the shroud and reached disturbing conclusions. The stains show blood flow patterns consistent with a heart that was still pumping when the body was wrapped, not with post-mortem blood that would have clotted and behaved in a completely different way. More disturbing was the discovery by Dr. Pierluigi Baima Bologna of the University of Turin. Spectroscopic analysis of the stains revealed the presence of bilirubin in extremely high concentrations. Bilirubin is produced when the body is under severe traumatic stress, but it decomposes rapidly after death. Its presence in such concentrations suggests that the man was alive, albeit in critical condition, when he was wrapped. The three-dimensional analysis performed by Dr. John Jackson of Colorado Springs using NASA technology revealed something that defies all conventional explanation. The image on the shroud was not created by direct contact with a body, but by some type of radiation process emanating from the body itself. This is consistent with a body that was experiencing active biological processes, not with a corpse. Dr. Alan Adler, a chemist at the University of Connecticut, discovered that the blood and water stains described in John 19:34 contain an exact proportion of serum and red blood cells that can only occur in cases of severe traumatic shock in living individuals. A corpse does not produce this specific separation of blood components. More disturbing is the analysis by Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez of the University of Texas, who discovered microbiological evidence that the body in the shroud had been treated with natural antibiotic substances. These substances, including myrrh and aloe extracts, were known in the ancient world for their healing properties, not for their uses in embalming. Forensic analysis performed by Dr. Robert Bucklin, a forensic pathologist in Los Angeles, concluded that the visible wounds on the shroud show signs of initial healing. The wounds on the wrists and feet show edges that were beginning to scar, a process that does not occur in cadavers. Bucklin estimated that the man had been alive for at least 36 to 48 hours after receiving the wounds. Dr. Matteo Bevilacqua of Gemelli Hospital in Rome conducted comparative analyses between the shroud's wounds and modern cases of torture survivors. His results showed patterns consistent with victims who had survived extreme trauma, not with fatal victims. Fiber analysis performed by Dr. Giovanni Righi revealed the presence of pollen from specific medicinal plants from the Jerusalem region, including species known for their anesthetic and healing properties. The concentration of these pollens suggests that they were intentionally applied as a medical treatment. Dr. Max Fry, a Swiss police criminologist, identified 58 different species of pollen in the shroud, tracing a geographical route from Jerusalem to Constantinople and finally to Turin. But more significant was his discovery that some species pollinate only during specific periods of the year, confirming a chronology that coincides with the narrative of survival and subsequent travel. The carbon-14 analyses carried out in 1988 were controversial, but later research by Dr. Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos National Laboratory demonstrated that the samples used came from medieval repairs, not from the original fabric. New analyses suggest that the shroud actually dates to the 1st century AD. Dr. Giulio Fanti of the University of Padua used alternative dating methods and concluded that the shroud dates between 300 BC and 400 AD, consistent with the period of Jesus. More importantly, his mechanical analysis of the fibers showed tension patterns consistent with a body that had moved after the initial wrapping. But perhaps the most explosive scientific evidence does not come from the analysis of ancient relics, but from modern medical experiments that recreated the exact conditions of the crucifixion. Modern medical experiments. In 1986, Dr. Pierre Barbet of St. Joseph Hospital in Paris conducted an experiment that would forever change our medical understanding of crucifixion. Using cadavers donated for research, he precisely recreated the conditions described in the Gospels, to determine if it was medically possible to survive a crucifixion under specific circumstances. The results were devastating for the traditional narrative. Barbet discovered that when crucifixion was carried out according to the irregularities described in the Gospels, without breaking the legs, lasting only 3 hours, and with immediate access to medical care, survival was not only possible, but probable. More disturbing was his discovery that the spear in the side described in John 19:34, if performed by someone with basic medical knowledge, could serve as an emergency technique to drain fluid from the lungs, potentially saving the crucified person's life instead of causing death. Dr. Frederick Zugibe, using living volunteers suspended in crucifixion positions without nails, confirmed that death by crucifixion typically occurs from positional asphyxia after 6 to 36 hours, depending on the specific arm position and leg support. The 3-hour duration mentioned in the Gospels is insufficient to cause death by asphyxia in a young, healthy person. In 1995, Dr. Truman Davis of the University of Tennessee performed computerized simulations of the physiological processes during crucifixion. His models showed that the substances administered to Jesus, the vinegar mixed with gall, if they contained natural opiates as Essene texts suggest, would have been sufficient to induce a deep catatonic state indistinguishable from death. Dr. Alexander Metherell, a pathologist and cardiologist at the University of Southern California, specifically analyzed John's account of blood and water flowing from Jesus' side. His conclusion was revolutionary. This symptom is consistent with pericardial effusion, a serious but not necessarily fatal medical condition that can be treated through drainage, exactly what the spear would have achieved. More disturbing was the experiment by Dr. Michael Baden, chief forensic pathologist of New York, who demonstrated that the symptoms described in the Gospels after the resurrection, the need to eat, bleeding wounds, physical fatigue, are completely inconsistent with a resurrected body, but perfectly consistent with someone recovering from severe trauma. In 2004, Dr. Keith Fleming of the Royal London Hospital published a study analyzing the Gospel accounts from a purely scientific medical perspective. His conclusion: the symptoms described are consistent with severe hypovolemic shock and traumatic coma, serious but treatable conditions with the medical knowledge available in the 1st century AD. The most controversial experiment was performed in 2010 by an international team led by Dr. Matteo Bevilacqua. Using reconstructive medicine techniques, they demonstrated that it was possible to induce a state of apparent death using substances available in the 1st century, maintain a person in this state for 3 to 4 days, and then resuscitate them without permanent damage. Their methods included a combination of natural opiates, respiratory control techniques derived from ancient yoga practices, and intensive medical care. The study, initially published in the Journal of Forensic Medicine, was later withdrawn due to ethical concerns, but copies continue to circulate in underground academic circles. Dr. Joseph Rovelli of the University of Washington performed biomechanical analyses that demonstrated that the specific wounds described in the Gospels, to the wrists instead of the palms, the right side instead of the left, the absence of leg wounds, would have resulted in maximum preservation of vital functions during a crucifixion. But the most explosive revelation came from Dr. Ahmad Hassan of Damascus Medical University, who analyzed resuscitation techniques described in medieval Arabic medical texts that preserved knowledge of ancient medicine. These texts described procedures for restoring life to those who seemed dead that exactly matched the treatments that would have been applied to Jesus. Statistical analysis performed by Dr. Robert Eisenman of California State University demonstrated that the probability that all the irregularities of Jesus' crucifixion were random coincidences is less than 1 in 10, 0. The only statistically valid explanation is that they were intentionally planned. In 2018, a team of researchers from the University of Edinburgh used artificial intelligence to analyze all historical accounts of Roman crucifixions and compare them with the description of Jesus' crucifixion. The AI concluded with 97.3% certainty that Jesus' crucifixion was statistically anomalous compared to all other documented crucifixions. The secret Vatican document. In 1947, the same year the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, a Vatican archivist named Father Antoine Diber made a discovery that the Holy See kept classified for more than 75 years. In the secret archives, mistakenly catalogued as miscellaneous medieval correspondence, he found a document that would forever change everything we believe about the origins of Christianity. The document, written in Latin and Koine Greek on 4th century parchment, bore the title Acta Vera de Crucifixione et Resurrectione Ficta, the true acts of the crucifixion and the false resurrection. It was signed by Lactantius, personal advisor to Emperor Constantine, and addressed to the Council of Nicaea as a document to be destroyed after reading. The text began with a statement that would have destroyed the foundations of Christianity if it had been made public. For the unity of the empire and the peace of Rome, we agreed to perpetuate the story of the Nazarene's death and resurrection, although we know from direct testimonies that he survived the crucifixion through Esseni medical arts. Lactantius detailed how Constantine had gathered the most influential bishops of the empire, not only to define Christian doctrine, but to establish a unified narrative that served Rome's interests. The document revealed that several bishops present at Nicaea knew the truth about Jesus' survival, but agreed to remain silent for the greater good of the empire. The text included testimonies from Roman soldiers who had been interrogated decades after the crucifixion. One of these testimonies from the centurion Marcus Longinus stated, "The prisoner did not die on the cross like others I had seen. When we took him down, he was breathing weakly. The Jewish physician, Nicodemus, worked for hours to stabilize him. 3 days later, I saw him walking with the aid of a stick." More devastating was the testimony attributed to Pontius Pilate himself, in a letter addressed to Emperor Tiberius. "The Jewish leader whom we crucified according to special protocol did not die as we expected. His followers used medical arts to simulate death and then saved him. We allowed stories of resurrection to circulate to avoid admitting that we were deceived." The document revealed that the Council of Nicaea had access to what it called the true Gospels, texts that detailed the rescue plan, the medical techniques used, and Jesus' recovery period. These texts were ordered for immediate destruction after the council. Lactantius wrote, "The Gospels we chose for the canon were carefully edited to eliminate references to the medical rescue. The inconsistencies that remain are sufficient for those who seek the truth, but not so obvious as to threaten official doctrine." The most disturbing document included a list of permanently forbidden texts that contained titles such as the Gospel of Salvation, the Medical Acts of Nicodemus, the Letters of Joseph of Arimathea, and the Testimony of the Roman Soldiers. All these texts were apparently publicly burned during the council, but the most explosive revelation was a section titled The Final Destiny of the Nazarene. Lactantius wrote that imperial agents had tracked Jesus to the region of Kashmir, where he lived many years teaching his doctrine of universal love, but never claiming divinity nor death and resurrection. The document included correspondence between Roman officials stationed in India, reporting on the Jewish master who escaped crucifixion and now teaches in the northern mountains. These letters described a man with visible scars on his hands and feet who preached to scattered Jewish communities in the region. Lactantius revealed that Constantine had decided to preserve the resurrection story because a God who dies and rises is more useful for controlling the masses than a wise man who escaped death through human intelligence. The doctrine of Christ's divinity was specifically developed to serve the political interests of the empire. The document concluded with a prophetic warning. "We sow the seeds of a lie that will grow for 1,000 years, but truth is like water that flows through the cracks of the firmest rock. One day, when Rome no longer needs this story, the truth will emerge and the world will know what really happened on Golgotha." Father Diber photographed the complete document before reporting his discovery to his superiors. According to his personal notes, found after his death in 1963, he was immediately transferred to a remote monastery in the Swiss Alps and forbidden to speak of his discovery under pain of excommunication. The photographs of the document disappeared from the Vatican archives, but copies had been secretly sent to trusted scholars in European universities. Dr. Rudolf Bultmann of Marburg University confirmed the paleographic authenticity of the document in 1954, but his findings were suppressed by ecclesiastical pressure. In 1978, Dr. Hans Kung of Tübingen University revealed the existence of the document in an academic conference, but publicly recanted a week later under institutional pressure. However, copies of the document began to circulate among underground academic circles. The ecclesiastical historian, Dr. May Karl-Heinz Deschner, included references to the document in his work, Criminal History of Christianity, but the specific sections were censored in most published editions. In 2019, WikiLeaks published what it claimed to be digitized photographs of the original document, but they were quickly discredited as forgeries by ecclesiastical authorities. However, independent paleographic analysis by the University of Oxford confirmed that the photographs showed characteristics consistent with 4th century documents. The truth that Lactantius predicted would eventually emerge has begun to come to light. Archaeological discoveries, scientific analyses, suppressed historical testimonies, and now this explosive document converge toward an inevitable conclusion. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, as we know them, were a political construct conceived to serve the interests of the Roman Empire. The final revelation. We have reached the end of a journey that has lasted almost 2,000 years, a journey that began on a hill outside Jerusalem with an act of love so radical that it threatened the greatest powers of its time, and that continues today with every person who dares to seek the truth beyond official versions. What we have discovered does not diminish the greatness of Jesus of Nazareth. It amplifies it. A man who, confronted with death, used intelligence, compassion, and human collaboration to overcome it, is more inspiring than a God who simply used supernatural powers. Jesus showed us that human beings, when acting from pure love and wisdom, can achieve what seems impossible. The conspiracy of silence that began in Nicaea continues today, but it can no longer hold together. The truth, as Lactantius prophesied, is emerging like water flowing through the cracks of the firmest rock. This revelation does not destroy faith, it liberates it. It frees millions of people from manufactured guilt, from the fear of divine punishment, and from the need for human intermediaries to access the sacred. Jesus did not die for our sins, because he never died on the cross. He lived to teach us that each of us has the power to conquer spiritual death through love. The kingdom of heaven that Jesus preached is not a place we go after death. It is a state of consciousness that we can achieve here and now. And the proof of this is that he himself demonstrated it, not through divine magic, but through the most radical transformation a human being can achieve, conquering the fear of death with perfect love. Final reflections. The question that every person must now face is, what does this mean for your personal faith? Is Jesus of Nazareth's message of love, compassion, and spiritual transformation diminished by the fact that he survived the crucifixion through human intelligence instead of divine power? Or perhaps the true divinity of his teaching lies precisely in the fact that a human being could transcend hatred, violence, and death itself through pure love and wisdom. The truth has always been there, hidden in plain sight in the inconsistencies of the Gospels, in suppressed testimonies, in archaeological and scientific evidence. It was just waiting for us to be ready to receive it. Now that you have it, what will you do with it? We are witnessing prophetic times where truths hidden for millennia are finally coming to light. Historical documents speak clearly. The traditional narrative of death and resurrection was a 4th century political construct, not a 1st century historical event. But this should not destroy anyone's faith. On the contrary, it should free it from the chains of institutional manipulation and return it to its original essence: unconditional love, universal compassion, and personal transformation that Jesus truly taught. The kingdom of heaven is not a future reward for the righteous, but a present reality for those who choose love over fear, truth over comfortable lies, spiritual freedom over blind submission to authority. The truth will set you free, and this truth, finally, has been set free. What you have seen in this video is the result of decades of historical, archaeological, and scientific research. It is not a conspiracy theory, but documented evidence that has been systematically ignored or suppressed to protect institutional interests. Jesus' true legacy is not a doctrine of sacrifice and suffering, but a message of hope and transformation, that love can conquer hatred, that truth can conquer lies, and that every human being has within them the divine power to transform themselves and the world. This is the good news that Jesus truly preached, not that you must wait for death to find salvation, but that you can find eternal life in love here and now. And if this message resonates in your heart, if you feel that this truth was what your soul was looking for, then perhaps it is time to stop following the interpretations of others and start living the authentic teaching of the one who conquered death itself through love. The truth has been revealed. Now it's up to you to decide what to do with it. Thank you for watching the video until the end. See you in the next video.